favorite illegal alien. Now, while I am a nerd, and I do read a lot of comic books, I was never really into superhero comic books. My introduction to comic books was from a professor who taught 18th century British literature, who made us read V for Vendetta. I don't think he got tenure. But I have read every single copyright case involving Superman, and actually any lawsuit involving Superman, because there was this narrative, and there is this narrative that's out there, that Joe Shuster and Jerome Siegel, the creators of Superman from Cleveland, Ohio, where did I go?
Yeah.
That they got fleeced, that they were given $130 for the character, and that was it. And the narrative is that copyright law only serves big entities and not authors. So, because I'm a copyright nerd, I wanted to find out if that is true, or if that stands true. So, in reading all these cases, what I found is that the truth is a bit more nuanced. So to go through this really quick, and I could talk for hours about this, which is not what you want to hear. No, I am keeping track of time, and Matt told me that if I run past 21 minutes, there will be people with stun guns and disappointed grandmothers. So first I need to talk about the origin of Superman. We'll do that briefly. Then I need to talk about the origin of copyright law. And then I'd like to talk about how copyright law has been applied to the character of Superman to let Superman grow into his tights and also expand in the zeitgeist. So forgive me if I gloss over some stuff here, but Superman was created by Jerome Siegel and Joe Shuster in 1933. This is 4 years after the Great Depression. They were 18 years old at the time, still in high school. A couple of wonderful nerds. They wrote for their school newspaper. And the very first iteration of Superman was a short story called The Reign of the Superman. And it was about a mad scientist who obtains the power through testing men standing in bread lines to control people's minds. So naturally, he becomes a bad guy, and we know that because he was bald in the story. A couple of months later, Siegel had the idea to rewrite the character as a hero of the oppressed. And the character of Superman really is the Depression-era hero. We'll look at some of this very shortly, but Superman is constantly besting machines. He is rooting out corruption in Action Comics #1. The plot line is basically Superman rooting out a corrupt senator, I believe. And on the cover, we'll see him literally holding a machine in the air. All right, let's move on a little bit here. And you can contrast Superman as the Depression-era hero with Batman, who is the capitalist hero. He makes capital and machines work for him, like shark repellent. Okay. So this is from the New York Times in 1975, and this is the narrative that I mentioned earlier, that Superman's creators died destitute. And with this article, there was a photograph of the crummy apartment that, I forget who was here, that, Shuster lived in a crummy apartment in Queens, where I live. And Siegel was living in a crummy apartment in LA, but since we're all in New York, we know every apartment in LA is crummy. And this narrative was largely created because Neil Adams, who worked on Batman, in the 1970s was trying to organize the writers and artists and unionize. And it had been tried a number of times before, but never really got traction. So Neil Adams used the story of Siegel and Schuster as a touchstone, and it, to a large degree, worked. But then that narrative persisted, despite the fact that I think it was actually fairly artificial. Okay, so let's see where we're going now. I think now we're going to talk about history of copyright law. So copyright law comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which tells us that Congress can create laws to promote the useful arts and sciences. And the Supreme Court has told us over and over again that Congress has the final say there. Whatever Congress does is more or less going to be upheld by the courts. Okay, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so copyright law, if you look at the history, and I'm going to gloss over a whole bunch of stuff here, but since from the statute of Anne to the 1909 Act, to the Act of 1976, to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, what we've seen is a balancing act. Initially, in the 1909 Act, only certain types of works were covered, and the term of protection was 14 years. Over the years, as the Copyright Act was revised, Congress eventually gave authors a renewal term, and with the idea being that, say you're Joe Shuster and Jerome Siegel, and you create Superman, and Superman becomes wildly successful. 14 years later, you could renegotiate all of the licenses or assignments that you made and make some money, because you have no bargaining power when you're 18 years old, or at least I certainly didn't, and neither did Joe and Jerome. Then the Supreme Court issued an opinion stating that the renewal term, meaning the term where you're supposed to be able to renegotiate your license, was assignable, which defeated the whole purpose, because then, right up front, anybody that an early creator was working with would demand that the renewal term be assigned. So it undermined the right of Congress. They had a bunch of hearings, and Samuel Clemens testified before Congress and said that what we really want as authors is a life of the author plus a certain amount of years. But then privately, he told one of the representatives that he had benefited from renegotiating his renewal term, so Congress did not do life of the author plus years until much later, despite that Supreme Court opinion. Okay, so we just glossed over more than 100 years of copyright law. Let's keep going. Okay, now, copyright law, what I learned, or my opinion in reading all of these copyright cases, was very important to Superman. I think without copyright law, you can argue about whether or not Joe and Jerome would have created the character without copyright law. I think that they would have, and I think that that's sort of a legal fiction, the idea that copyright law incentivizes creativity. I mean, I think that it does, but we don't really need, I think that's not really the point. The point is that after they created Superman, the character that we know would not be around today, but for copyright law. And here's this great quote from Judge Lasker. These are all judges from New York. I try not to use Ninth Circuit opinions. So, now we're going to talk about the history of Superman here. And this is other than the reign of the Superman, which is a short story, this is the first treatment that Joe and Jerome did. And they did it for a magazine, because Detective Comics were very popular at the time, and by Detective Comics, that was, we'll see in a second, but that was all magazine format, and Joe and Jerome, got the idea to do a workup for a magazine, and they submitted it to a bunch of publishers. It was actually, we skipped over a lot. It was actually, it was accepted by Detective Dan Comics to turn it into a magazine, but then they rescinded the offer. And Joe Shuster took it pretty hard. He threw their entire work into the fireplace, and Siegel literally dove in like a goddamn Superman and saved just the cover. This is the only existing thing there. And we can see a little bit of the Superman from the reign of the Superman. He looks like he has a receding hairline, and we don't really know what's going on there, but he's probably a good guy now, I think. This is so after being rebuffed by Detective Dan and the magazine format, Jerome and Joe decided, all right, newspapers, that's the ticket. We'll do a newspaper format. So they worked up a newspaper treatment, and they submitted it to a ton of different newspapers, and none of them accepted it. This is going on for 4 years, until in 1937, Detective Comics, which published Slam Bradley and The Spy, which again, Detective Comics were where it was at. That was the thing, right? Superheroes were just, well, they didn't exist yet, but they're a little different than these noir guys. But Detective Comics hired Siegel and Shuster, and at that point, Siegel and Shuster were thinking, you know what? Screw Superman, forget that. That was just one character we came up with. We got whole heads full of ideas here. We're young, coming out of Cleveland. We're gonna rule the world here. So they took employment, and they first in 1938 signed their employment agreement. And as part of that, and this was a tangential point to them at the time, they did sign over all the rights to the character Superman for $130 in 1938 money. Then, after, I'm glossing over a whole lot more here as well, but a newspaper syndicate, McClure, submitted a bunch of material to Detective Comics because McClure Newspaper Syndicate wanted to expand its offerings into a magazine format. And some of the material that they submitted were actually strips that, or treatments or whatever you call them. I don't know, I wasn't alive in the 40s or 30s, whatever these people. Was actually original magazine format, newspaper format Superman characters. So when that happened, newspapers started to syndicate the Superman character. And because those strips were starting to be sort of successful, Joe and Jerome renegotiated their employment agreement in September, and they were able to get quite a bit more money. We can talk about just how much money in a little bit here. Okay. So this is Action Comics #1. As I said, you can see Superman literally lifting a car. He is the heroic reversal of John Henry. He's besting the machines, and people always forget that John Henry died in the end. Superman doesn't die, at least as long as we all remember him and clap and all that stuff. Okay. All right. So the first major challenge to the character Superman was Wonderman. And Wonderman was published by Bruns Publications. It was not the character that Stan Lee named Wonderman in the 60s. This is a different Wonderman. And you can see here, it's not a car, but he is lifting a plane or stopping a plane into the air. And what you don't see, this is just a comparison of the covers, but when the courts were trying to deal with this new medium, they were looking at, okay, so these are pictures and also text. And the court, well, first of all, Wonderman was created by Will Eisner, who who at the time was publishing astrology magazines. Wonderman was outselling Superman. So Detective Comics retained a white shoe law firm in New York. And without this lawsuit, Superman probably would have faded away. The court looking at this, again, this is a new medium, and I'm not sure it will come out exactly the same way, but one of the things that you can get from this presentation and also superhero comics is that bad guys lose. And in this case, the evidence that was presented to the court had Will Eisner, although he's later sort of recanted some of this, but if you're not doing it under oath, then it doesn't matter. So under oath, he said that he was directly copying Superman. And in the issues, there were almost exact copies of images. The text was essentially, they changed some of the wording, but the sequence was exactly the same. And the Southern District of New York issued an injunction preventing Wonderman Comics from continuing to infringe on the Superman character. And the Bronze Publications appealed that decision to the Second Circuit, which is relatively rare. I mean, I couldn't afford to appeal something to the Second Circuit, and I could do the appeal at the Second Circuit. So the fact that they did that, and the fact that Detective Comics was retaining a white shoe law firm to see both the district court case and the appeal to the Second Circuit shows how much was invested in the Superman character. I think I gotta speed up a little bit here. So, okay. The next big challenge was Captain Marvel from Wiz Comics. And again, here you see Carr, he's besting machinery. And again, bad guys lose, right? So Captain Marvel was published by Fawcett. And Fawcett's employees testified that their bosses literally told them to copy directly from Superman. The court said that the only real difference is the color of their costumes. Captain Marvel's alter ego, by the way, was a radio reporter, not a print reporter. Okay. All right, and then we'll just skip that. One of the great things about reading all these cases is sometimes the exhibits have Action Comics #1. I wanted to get into a bunch of fair use here, but it looks like we have, Matt, how are we doing on time? You got like 2 minutes?
I got like 4.
4. Okay, let's power through this. Okay, so fair use is a judicially created doctrine that is then codified by the Copyright Act. There's 4 non-exclusive factors the courts will look at to determine whether something is a fair use. And I think that while copyright protection allowed Superman to develop into the robust character that we all know today, the fair use exceptions to copyright allowed Superman to expand outside of his tights and enter the zeitgeist. And we'll just breeze through this real quick. So the best known example is The Greatest American Hero. Anybody remember this show? Anybody? Yeah, okay. So, and these are the 4 fair use factors here. First is purpose and character of the use. The Greatest American Hero was, if you're not familiar, is a guy, Hinckley, who was, I think, a school teacher, who finds a superhero suit, but he loses the instructions with hilarious results. So the purpose of the use here is to make fun of Superman. That's a great Saturday Night Live sketch, we'll skip over here. And so parody is not really, people always say it's a defense to copyright. That's actually not totally true, but it does change the analysis. It differs from satire, which comments on society at large, whereas a parody comments on the underlying work, which is why it needs to use the underlying work. Okay, and there's some great quotes in here. That's Crazy Eddie. I wish I could show you that commercial. Nature of the underlying work. So you don't need to skip that. Who is Superman? You know, he's grown over the years. Is he a communist? Huh? Yeah? Think about it. Is he this guy? Or is he the Depression era hero that we all know and love? Or did he retire and move to New York and become a paralegal or something? We don't really know. The point is that the character has evolved over the years. Matt, I'm getting there. Okay. The amount used is something, and I'll just say, if you work in a creative field, people always tell me they've heard of this like 30% rule or 20% rule, meaning that if you use less than that amount of the original work, then it's fair use. That's bogus. I know that because there's a case involving Gerald Ford's memoir, and The Nation published 300 words of that memoir, but it happened to be the 300 words about why Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, which in the court's estimation was the only reason anybody would read that fucking book. And then this is an example of not fair use. This is a singing telegram super stud who was clearly trying to play off of Superman. And then I'll just really quickly get to some examples of what is a fair use. This is a wonderful graphic novel about the idea of the Superman. And it's, in my view, protected by fair use. And this is a perfect example of how Superman entered the zeitgeist. And actually, that's the subject of this entire book, is how Superman is more than just a character for us now. And then I'll just really quickly jump to this because it's fun. I don't think this is a fair use, but it's a comic coloring book and it's topical. And I'm done.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Night event near you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.